All right, good morning, and welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn. You choose the topics, and we find the experts. This morning, we are absolutely thrilled to have Keith Schengili-Roberts as our visiting dojo master today. Keith is a longtime practitioner of information architecture, which is why we tapped him for this session. He is a researcher, information gatherer, which explains how he's so good at all of this. He likes to find out things and see how they fit together. He can work at the top high level, he can work at the bottom granular level, and we're grateful that he can talk to us today about one of these highly requested topics. He lectures at the University of Toronto and works for the DITA Oasis Committee, and we're absolutely thrilled he is here today. Keith wants you to save your questions until the end, so be sure to type them in to the question window when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. All right, Keith, I'm ready to pass control to you.
Okay.
Show your screen, and it's all yours.
Okay, let's see. Here we are. And let me just get
Looks
into
good.
my setup. Oops. Okay. Yeah. Always get this on the wrong slide, on the wrong display. Hang on a second. Let me just switch this over to the other screen. Once I figure out how to do that.
Put that display settings up in the upper leftish. Haha.
Ah, that way. Okay.
Magic.
That'll work. Woo. Hello there, folks. Right. So here I am in the TC Dojo armor. Very fashionable. Hopefully for today. For the as I mentioned in the one of the promo pieces, I am your content couturier for today. I just to sort of give you a sense of this. I mean, I've been working with in the technical writing field for over a quarter century. I've been working with DITA for over 12 years. I should also hasten to add that I am actually doing this from my home office, and there is a dog, and you may just hear him barking, probably at the mailman who's just arrived to deliver our mail. And there's also some drilling going on, which hopefully doesn't get any closer, or hopefully they're on their lunch break at this point. So if there's any extraneous sounds, my apologies ahead of time. So without further ado, let's get into style guides. And I also want to say this is not just about DITA. I mean, I am evangelist for DITA, and I will be talking about it in part, but this is not solely about DITA, as you're about to see. Okay, so here's what I'm going to cover. What I'm really going to be talking about is building an internal documentation set and what are the things that need to go into it, and then I'll be talking about what should be in a writing style guide, documenting your processes. Having a DITA then specific style guide, assuming you're using DITA, and then having a DITA output test document. And we've already gone over most of this. I guess the other thing worth pointing out here is that I'm also the chair of the DITA adoption committee, and we're trying to do some cool things that you'll hopefully see. But before the end of the month, we will be relaunching the dita.xml.org website. Hopefully before the end of the month. You'll also see some new white papers from us on the Oasis website relating to one is actually going to be on style guides, oddly enough. So the timing for this is actually perfect. Another on XSL processing and a few more things. So look for those in the future. Some of you may also know me as a DITA writer, and this is a blog I started just over 6 years ago with close to 250,000 hits in overall that time. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a resource that talks about things like DITA conferences, books on DITA. I have a fairly comprehensive list of companies that are using DITA. It's almost up to 700 different companies. So if you're looking for work and you have DITA experience and you're trying to find out who else uses it, that was actually the original inspiration for that particular list. So that's something to worth to have a look at. And also just news on and views on DITA use and so on and so forth. I won't dwell upon this too much. So now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about why you would want to build an internal documentation set for your team. And much of this, these reasons I think here are fairly obvious. But it's good to have something like this on hand, to, in case you need to justify the time that is required to build up these types of docs for your documentation team. And make no mistake, it will take time to create these things. I'll also advocate that you don't do this all at once, but try to do this gradually over time. And again, looking at the reasons, you want to provide consistent content. You want to make sure that there is a single coherent voice to what you're trying to put across in your technical docs. You also, if when you have new team members, this is something you want to either print out or email to them as a PDF and say, hey, day one, please read this. Also, it also helps settle disputes with ongoing longtime members of your team, because if somebody says, well, we can use this as possessive, and it's like, no, we can't use apostrophes with trademark names. It's you can use this as a document to help resolve those disputes, and then make sure that they're actually covered, and so that should the question ever come up again, you can always point to it as a reference. And also just, it's great to have as institutional memory, because, what if you get hit by a bus, or the people who were having a dispute about the possessives, they get hit by a bus and nobody remembers that. Somebody say 5 or 6 years from now can then look at this information, and it's like, okay, yes, this is how we are supposed to point our put our particular voice across. So what I'm going to argue that you need, and keep in mind that you can have more internal documents than just what I'm going to describe here, but you will at the very base will probably want to have these two if you're not using DITA, and then an additional 2 documents if you are. So if you're not using DITA, I would say that every tech writing team has to have, or should have, a writing style reference, and also at the bare minimum have an outline of your internal processes. If you're using DITA, you need an additional DITA style guide that talks about proper coding techniques for writing DITA content. And then also, I would argue, having a separate test document to make sure that what you actually output is what you're expecting. So what are the benefits of having a writing style guide? And now keep in mind, this is this is DITA and non-DITA. So a lot of people have done work on this already, so borrow from this. Things that I would recommend having a look at would include things like the Chicago Manual of Style or the Associated Press Style Book. Also things like, say, the Microsoft Manual of Style for Technical Publications, which is now in its 4th edition. Strunk & White's The Elements of Style, that is a classic. And when I was a manager, I had a small stack of them, and I would make sure that brand new writers would have a copy on hand to have a look at when they join the team. If you're actually in software engineering, you might want to have a look at the ISO spec that I have listed there. It's getting a bit dated, but the general stuff is still very good. And I'd also recommend, if you're in a very specific industry segment, such as, say, working with, say, a legal department or medical device manufacturer, or any very specific industry that may have a requirement for parts of its style, research that area to see if there is an existing style guide or other related materials that you might be able to use so that your end users will be familiar with, or more familiar with the type of content that you'll be producing, because you'll know your audience that much better. I should also add that the Chicago Manual of Style as well as the AP Stylebook are also available online, and they're actually designed in part to be accessed by groups such as technical writing groups, and you can get annual annual subscriptions to those services, and look things up very quickly and easily. And by the way, if you want a copy of the Elements of Style, again, it's not expensive, but free is even better. And there is a nice copy available on Project Gutenberg. So if you go to Project Gutenberg and type in Elements of Style, you'll find a nice free copy of the original first edition from 1920 that you can reference. And what these external references can do for you, they can give you guidelines for things like, say, grammar usage. So, are you going to be using the serial or Oxford comma, or perhaps the walk-in or Shatna comma? Hopefully not the latter two in your docs. It also can provide direction on such things as tone and voice, how to write in, say, the first, second, or third person, and the advantages, disadvantages of passive versus active voice. And in general, it gives you a model that you can then extend into your own style reference. So then we look at, building your own writing style guide. So you can refer to these other things, but you actually still want to build something that is, wholly, that is still wholly yours. You need to cover specific instances that might make sense just for your context. So, you want to cover such things as terminology choices. So when you're using a term, in this case, I've got 3D, is it 3D, 3-D, or do you actually spell out the 3 as a word and then follow it with a D? All are valid, but you probably want to stick to one in your documents. Again, trying to get across the idea of having a single consistent voice to put across to your audience. You want to talk about things like, say, case usage for titles and captions, and again, trying to be consistent. List item usage, do you have a period at the end of the final point, for example, or not? And what is the type of spelling that you have? Do you use US or British, or the combo sort of Canadian, which sort of picks and chooses, picks and choose from one or the other depending on context? And when you're pulling these examples together, always illustrate with examples. You also want to talk about things that are very specific to your company or product. Talk about things like, company or product names. Can the company name be used as a possessive, for example? Can the, XYZ have an apostrophe S at the end of it, if that's the name of your company? In most cases, not, but it is good to spell these types of things out. You also want to list things like your existing copyrights and trademarks, and always, be up to date with the current status of your trademark. So it has a trademark move from being a trademark to a registered trademark. You want to make sure you keep in touch with legal regarding that, and also to to update that information, and of course communicate that to the members of your team accordingly. You can also talk about how do you use trademarks? Are they nouns or adjectives, or can they be used possessively? And what I would then say is that well, here are a couple examples. When providing examples, try to provide incorrect and then correct usage. I think this is a really good way of doing things, because it can be used as a basis for creating much of your style guide content. So lead with what is not the way to do it, and then talk about here is a correct way of doing it. So for the one at the bottom, talking about do not use trademarks possessively. Use the generic noun that follows to indicate possession. So the incorrect way would be the XYZ's cable, and the XYZ in this case is the name of the trademark. Cables are included in the box. That does sound kind of awkward. So the correct way is actually just to say, at least in this case, to say the XYZ headphones cable. So in other words, the XYZ company or the trademark is the adjective to the headphone, which is then, say, the noun in this case, which talks about the example above that. And again, all I'm trying to say here is, like, provide examples. Don't just state these things, because it may not always be exactly clear what is meant, but the examples provide a terrific example, a terrific idea, and make it, absolutely clear the points that you're trying to put across. Other things that you could potentially cover, and by the way, I could easily have made this an hour-plus long presentation. So, these are just other things that I know I've done in the past when helping to compile style guides. So, all of these things that you see here, this is really just the start of what you can do to help build an internal style guide for yourself. Okay, and the other thing that I would argue from that all tech doc teams need is to talk about your processes. And why would you want to have one? Well, again, it helps new people who are unfamiliar with your existing processes. So you bring somebody new on board. Here's how we do things. Here's a document that describes how we actually produce our documentation within this particular team. It also serves as a reference for when any sort of novel situation arises, and can help settle disputes. And it also helps make concrete what may have never previously been written down. This can be one of again, this is the sort of the what if you're hit by a bus sort of thing. What if Bill was the only person on the team who actually knew how this particular document was sent off to the printer prior to it actually being created, and he was struck down with a nasty cold and is now hospitalized, for example. So you don't want to be in that situation. You want to describe these things fully. And what I suggest you cover is, you want to outline your publication process from the initial draft stage to the finalized and approved document, detailing each and every step along the way. You also want to define all the rows in the process. And also, and what the way I highly recommend describing this is creating what's known as a Swimlane flowchart, which outlines the process in terms of the individual roles and what those people have to do in those roles. And if you're not familiar with that, here is a typical Swimlane diagram. And as you can see, there are different roles which are mentioned on the left-hand side, and it details what's the expectations from each of those roles, and what do they do, and what's the next step in the process, and who do they communicate to. Now this is super simple. I would more typically when I see this sort of thing, you may have an initial Swimlane diagram for something that might just be talking about the editing process or content creation from the subject matter expert to just the writer. But it's nice to have something sort of an overall, and also looking at things from a role-based perspective, so that who should be doing what at each particular stage along the journey. Now we're going to move into DITA specific material, and I'm going to talk about why DITA style in air quotes matter. So the DITA specification is well, let's face it, it is kind of large. The actual DITA 1.3 specification, as printed out, I think comes to, I think it's just under or just over 800 pages worth of content, and that's a lot of stuff to cover. So you don't necessarily want to just point people to that. You want to talk about what are the tags that you use and in what context. Also, if you have things like constraints which have been put into place, you definitely want to cover those. You also want to emphasize and cover best practices, which are local. They're specific to your particular team. So in other words, there are many different ways that you can write DITA code. Like you can have paragraphs before say an unordered or ordered list item, but is that what you encourage, or is that is that not what you're encouraging? It's valid DITA, but you may find that you want to have it one way or the other for your own particular reasons. It's also a chance to educate, and again, new writers, and also serve as a reference for the more experienced writers on the team. And these are the types of things that I would argue it ought to contain. So define the content that should go into each topic type, for example. You really want to provide information on how to properly type the content that goes into concept, task, reference, gloss entry, and troubleshooting topic types. You also want to talk about things like, say, any nesting rules. So, in other words, how deep do you have list items go? I know that when I was at AMD, we had instituted a rule that said that, you can't have a list item that was more than, I think it was like 3 levels deep, because at that point it's like, well, if you have like a sub list item, you probably really want to, refactor that and come up with a better way of presenting that information. You want to look at things like, say, table structures, how images are managed. Do you insert figure and caption? Do you have a separate library topic type for holding or storing images? If so, what are the conventions around that? Also want to talk about valid image types. Like, do you use PNG, JPEG? Do you use static image types, or do you use things like scalable vector graphics or MathML? And if so, how are they then incorporated within the content of your manuals? You should also outline things like your preferred block and inline tags. Talk about your key structure, naming convention, and where to find them within the map. And also talk about things like, say, filtering conditions and how or when to use them. And of course, as always, provide relevant examples. Here's one example, just sort of throwing this out here. Here's an example for writing short descriptions. So you have a task topic. You want to write task short descriptions so that readers understand what they can accomplish once they've read the topic. So for a topic title that is entitled "How to Set Security Settings," the incorrect way would be use this procedure to configure security settings for the ABC product. It's correct, but it doesn't really tell you, an awful lot about that particular topic. One of the ways I like to say is, think of it as like a summary or like a précis of what is contained within the topic and why the user would be interested in it. So in this case, the correct way would be security settings determine who can and cannot use the ABC product, and that gives the user a much better idea as to why they would what they could accomplish once they have read that topic. This is just, again, one idea, but this is a particular best practice that you might want to incorporate into your own DITA style guide. Don't forget to talk about map-specific usage. Describe and illustrate a typical book map structure, and look at the sample metadata that you may expect to find within your own doc team's book maps. If you have a subject scheme, make sure you list what all of the elements within that subject scheme are, all the metadata contained within it, and describe the values. So don't just expect people to understand immediately what all of the metadata values within a subject scheme are. Talk about, this is what we're referring to when we're referring to this particular metadata element, and here is the context. Also outline any particular nesting rules you may have for topics and maps within your book maps, as in, like how do you define chapters, for example. That's something else you might want to talk about within a DITA style guide. You also want to talk about writing for reuse. So words to avoid, such as, the image above or the paragraph below or the new thing. It's like, well, it may not be new forever. So, these are things you might want to avoid with, in keeping reuse in mind. Also want to ensure topics convey a single idea or procedure. You want to put across the idea that, you don't want to have what's known as an omnibus topic that talks about, absolutely everything. Try to make sure that writers focus on individual ideas and conveying those in individual topics, as they ought to be. Describe the rules on how and when to conref material. You might, for example, only want to have conref at the block or sentence level, but not the phrase level. And if you have library topics for conref content, again, describe what they are and where to find them. Also key, so to speak, is key usage you may have implemented and how they're structured within a typical document. You might also, if you have specific output types, you again want to describe what's going on. So, you might want to document when and where output class is used and the intended effect they have. And again, if you implement constraints or if you instead deprecate particular elements, outline what the domain or specific elements are and why you've actually done that. And there's an example there that talks about, like not wanting to use italic, bold, or teletype because it doesn't actually convey any information from a semantic standpoint. And then the last document I would recommend having is what's known as a DITA output test document. So this again is a general reference for output formatting, and it demonstrates the look and feel of your output, such as say PDF or HTML5 output, for example, that gives an idea for your team and those who may have an interest in corporate branding, such as say a product manager or whoever is interested in the marketing angle of your product, to make sure that it has the same, general look and feel and professional look of that your company wants to put across. It should contain, for example, all of the typical branding elements, legal boilerplate information, anything that would go into a typical technical documentation publication. You want to make sure is there. You also want to have a comprehensive look at how content can be structured. It's also a good idea to have edge cases covered. So what happens if you have a list item, in this case, that goes past what's allowed by best practices? And this example shows you what can be done with XSL, where you can actually have, if somebody actually writes content, in this case where the list nesting level has been exceeded, it displayed it in this case in a beautiful green and red that really stands out on a page. It's something that's really easy to see when you're actually doing like a pre-flight check on a document. It's like, oh, we need to go back and fix this before it goes out the door. I also recommend having a Unicode font test. And this is a localization test to ensure your font can handle all Unicode glyphs correctly. There's a lovely thing I highly recommend called IXIASOFT, which is available from this particular URL. It essentially has that phrase, which is a phrase which is guaranteed to make locals stand back in awe and treat you with the utmost respect. At least that's the idea. And I think it's been translated to well over 100+ languages. So you can just use this phrase and the glyphs that are provided at this link, throw them into your process and see whether or not your fonts can actually handle it. You may never write a manual that will need to be done in using Anglo-Saxon runes, but the point is that, if you're trying to expand to new languages, here's a chance to see how well your fonts perform, and then to make sure that you have the support needed for anything specific to say French, Portuguese, Icelandic, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Korean, what have you, before you actually have a need to go out and do that. And again, if you have output class formatting, this is kind of you want to make sure that you cover off all of the examples and then display what they actually look like. And this is one particular example here of how it's implemented and then what to expect as an output. Other tools that can also help you, keep in mind, there are things like AcroLinks, which analyzes content and as it's actually being written by your writers, and you can customize that to some extent. If you're using DITA, you can also use schematron rules, which can help enforce house style. And there's a really nice document from the makers of the Oxygen XML editor, from which this one example is actually derived, which provides an idea as to how you can actually use schematron. It comes with a whole bunch of pre-packaged things that you can use right off the bat. And if you're using the DITA, again, there's a thing called the freely available called the QA plugin, which checks documents for use of things like passive voice, word count, junk words, and so on. Keep in mind that these really are all living documents. Typically, an editor is entrusted with adding to or updating these documents on a regular basis. You want to make sure that there's at least one person who is assigned the work to do this, to make sure that things are updated constantly. It should also embody, what they cover. So when you're writing the content, it should in itself be a best practices document while also talking about best practices. Whenever there's any sort of style-related dispute within your team, the decided outcome that has come to should also be covered in these particular documents. And keep in mind, don't be daunted by the fact that you have, potentially these big things to make, these big, potentially monolithic seeming documents to manufacture. Just build them gradually, one after the other, and as time goes on, you will build up a corpus that, as I say, becomes a living document that describes exactly how and why you document things the way you do. And so that's about it. Why do this? It's a basis for creating consistent message and voice for your users. It educates new members of your team. It's a reference for existing team members. It provides an outline for the processes to follow, talks about best practices. It can test edge cases in things like formatting, and hey, it can help to settle disputes. My final word is actually from late great Bruce Lee. Absorb from this what is useful, discard what is not, and add what is uniquely your own. And by the way, if you're going to the DITA North America conference later this month, check out Deb Besant's presentation on the same subject, which is what is a DITA style guide and why do I need one? Further reading, here's some other things to have a look at. The DITA style guide I highly recommend from Tony Self. And there's information on the QA plugin for the DITA OT and Schematron. That's it for me.
All right, let me bring you back over here briefly to show you what's coming up while you type in your questions. We've got 2 on the stack, but usually everybody writes their questions in right here at the end. So coming up, we've got the TC Dojo Mastermind. This is a monthly member-driven discussion group, kind of a community of practice, where attendees present their specific challenges on topics on their mind in a confidential environment. It's been running for a couple of years. We have 2 of them going at the moment. One is focused on everything TechCom. I think last month we debated inline linking, stay or go. We talked about graphics and other things, and it is not product specific in any way. The other one is product specific. It's for Arbortext because that's part of the community we serve. You can sign up at the TC Dojo website to join if you want to see that. In our next TC Dojo session, we're going to have Bruce Poropat from the the Berkeley STC chapter coming to talk about minimalism. Some of his examples are real doozies, and it's going to be a good time. Trust me. Oh, I've seen it. It's great. If you want to find out what's coming up or how to sign up for that session or any of the others, you just go to tcdojo.org, and at the bottom of the page, you can sign up for any session coming up. All right, Keith, are you ready for the hard questions?
Oh, sure.
What suggestions do you have for making this information accessible? Relegating such information to a static PDF is a barrier to use and isn't easily dynamically updated. I've thought about going the wiki route, but not convinced that's much of an improvement. Your thoughts?
Well, the first thing I was going to say was wiki is certainly one possibility. I think if anything though, having perhaps having an internal website that written say in HTML5 that provides easily editable examples. And also provides things in, say, something like a PDF format in case somebody actually wants to have that as a printable reference that they can actually pin on their cubicle wall, for example. In fact, one thing I didn't, again, if I had more time, one of the other little things I'd recommend is having a one-page kind of like cheat sheet for here are all the do's and here are all the don'ts. Maybe one page for each. Just sort of outlining, extracted from the internal style guide documentation, the key things to do and what not to do, and have them, potentially in a printable format so that people can just, refer to it on their cubicle wall. And I know I've whipped up things like that in the past for members of my old documentation teams. But I would say that, having a PDF, if we're talking DITA, it can be, whatever you want. Having one of the advantages of having it as a PDF is that, on day one, you can actually say, sit down, read this, mark it up with your pen if you have questions. I think I've done it in the past with new members of joining a team, and sometimes I've learned all sorts of things because it's like, I've never thought about that particular question before. Hey, maybe we should talk about that in the future. That's one of the advantages of having things in a print format, because I find that people are more contemplative and are more ready to comment in that. But otherwise, I would say, you know, a wiki would also be a good idea, not a great idea, but a good idea. And I would say perhaps have it as an internal living HTML5 based document on and an internal web server would also be another good way of doing things. And one of the advantages of that, of course, would be to help point people to external resources such as the whether or not you point to, say, the AP Style Guide or the Chicago Manual of Style, or, you know, have subscriptions to those types of services. You can easily link to those and also potentially draw examples in directly into your code. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, well, let us know if that answers the question, and we'll move on to the next one. You got some big ones coming up. All right.
Oh, technical difficulties. Oh, I'm cutting out. No,
there you go. All right. Possible intersection between subsets of a style guide and a technical glossary, especially vis-a-vis DITA's emphasis on content reusability. So selected portions of style guide content are accessible within information products. I'm not sure. That's a tough question.
Ooh, okay. You know, if I'm interpreting that correctly, what it's saying is that it is, you know, isn't an idea to have a glossary of technical terms, both combined within something like a DITA specific set of style guides, so that the writers have an idea as to what they're writing about. So somebody, you know, if someone is using a particular acronym term that is, you know, highly technical, they know exactly what that means and in what context to use it. If the question is, can you then extend that to external publications, I would say definitely yes. But again, it depends on the context of the publication, so and the audience as well. For audiences who may not be familiar with all of the terms that you may be using, then yes, sharing that information across internal and external docs does make sense. And again, I can think of some training materials in particular that I've worked on where that actually made a lot of sense. Again, it just provides information. You make sure that everybody is, you know, talking about the same thing. But I'd say that, you know, on the whole, there are advantages to both sides, both internally and externally for this type of thing. But you don't want to tell your readers necessarily, you know, what these things are defined as, because they may, you know, it's like, you know, if I'm a medical doctor and I know what this particular term is, having a glossary reminding me of what this would be essentially a form of talking down to you. But if you're talking to a different audience that may not have encountered these types of terms for the first, you know, then that would make a lot of sense. So the only way I can really answer that is maybe depending on context.
All right. And here we have a new one. Oh, it's clarification on that. If style guide defines product-specific nouns and verbs, why redefine them in a separate tech glossary, especially if the tech glossary terms can be threaded into user-facing content? I see what you're after. Does that make more sense to you too?
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, I think this sort of speaks to the idea of these being living documents. They should, in some way, be self-documenting. So you want to use the best practices as you're describing them, and keep in mind that, you know, what might make a lot of sense for you as a, you know, tech writer who's been in the business for years may not be something that is obvious to a junior tech writer who is just coming into things. So providing, you know, like I part of the reason why I throw in the example of using possessives with a trademark term, or using the company name as an adjective rather than as a noun, is exactly because there is conceivably situations where somebody might try to do that, and then you can always point to this type of document saying this is how we are supposed to be doing it. And again, this speaks to consistency of tone and voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. I think that's it. Thanks, everybody. Keith, that was fantastic. Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
and doing that. And thanks, everybody, for attending and the excellent questions. We will see you next month for minimalism. Super
Woohoo!
fun. Everybody loves that topic, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye, folks.